Hi everyone, I'm Trevor, and my co-authors on this project were Chris Liu, Marilyn Walker, and Jeannie Fox-Tree. We had quite a few findings in this paper, but there are just a couple that I want to highlight for you today. I'll start by setting the stage. Lexical entrainment is the process by which interlocutors adapt to each other's speech patterns, and this has been studied experimentally in the lab in several different ways. I'll mention two of those ways. The first one is on this slide, and it's referred to as the tangram task. In this task, participants attempt to match ambiguous tangram shapes with their partner's scrambled set of identical shapes, generally with only audio communication available. In this task, performance is measured by how many tangram shapes pairs are able to match in a given amount of time. And as you'd expect, participants get faster at matching over repeated rounds, partially by agreeing implicitly about what terms to use, so lexical entrainment. The second method I wanted to mention is the map task. And in the map task, one person does their best to describe a route that they see on their map, and the other person attempts to recreate that route on a map without the route. Also, the maps tend to have different features. So like you can see, for instance, the right map here includes 2 lakes, while the left map only really has one in the top right. These lab tasks and others like them have been instrumental in showing clear evidence of what lexical entrainment looks like. And we wanted to extend that important work by assessing lexical entrainment in a real-world setting. So the first question of the talk is whether lexical entrainment works similarly in the wild to the way it does in the lab. And to do this, we use the art walk task, which is a real-world blend of both the tangram task and the map task. It has a director who sits in the lab with a map and photos of real art, talking to a follower who walks around downtown identifying and taking pictures of target art objects. So if you imagine yourself as a director, you'd see something like this. You can see there's a picture of some art on the left and a map on the right. You'd need to help your interlocutor navigate to the location and then identify the artwork. And if you're a follower, you'll see something like this. So while the art walk task is similar to the map task and the tangram task in that they're all communication tasks with asymmetric knowledge, it's also more natural behavior than comparing abstract shapes in a psychology laboratory, for instance. In all, the art walk corpus includes 48 mobile phone conversations with 24 pairs of friends and 24 pairs of strangers, and on average, they are 40-minute dialogues. So one additional piece of information we're bringing in for this analysis is extroversion scores that were collected from the participants. This is just a bit of foreshadowing for the second finding that I'll talk about today. And as with most things in life, the decision to use more naturalistic data had some trade-offs in the form of differences in the data. So if we had used the tangram task or the map task, a 40-minute session would allow participants to match a lot of tangrams or draw a lot of routes. But physically walking places and looking for art takes quite a bit longer. And that meant that instead of having 6 rounds of a dozen or more trials each, we only had 2 rounds of 5 trials each. So the usual measurement technique in studies like this, measuring performance by measuring how many targets were correctly identified, it was going to be a poor measure of entrainment for us. So instead, we looked at the number of individual descriptors that directors used. And a quick note that there are a couple reasons we used director descriptors and not follower descriptors, one of which was lower audio quality through the cell connection for followers, but more importantly, because followers had far more degrees of freedom when they're talking about potential targets than directors did until they had correctly identified a target. In other words, when a follower was describing artwork, we had no way to be sure they were talking about the right target. They could have been talking about anything. Like there's lots of different art pieces. It may not have even been an art piece that they're talking about. So here is an example of what some of those descriptors look like. In round 1, our director said, it's like an emo penguin or something that looks like it was spray painted, like an outline. It's like a penguin wearing a beanie, and it's colored in white mostly, and it looks pretty sad. And then in the second round, they said, the sad penguin thing with the beanie. And another example in round 1, they said, you'll be looking for pretty much their spiky rocks, like they're rocks with little spikes on them. Rocks kind of like oval-shaped rocks with spikes on them. One of the rocks is chocolate gray, another is light brown. And then in round 2, they said the spiky rocks. And I want to take a brief detour here because descriptors are an interesting thing, and I think this audience would also find it to be an interesting thought experiment to think about whether we could identify descriptors computationally. And the paper has some more examples of descriptors that could be particularly challenging for a computational approach, my favorite of which is, if it had hands, they would be doing spirit fingers. But instead of taking on the challenge of working out how to computationally identify them, we asked research assistants to identify them instead and developed several protocols for them to do so, achieving modest to good agreement between the research assistants by various reliability measures. So regarding our question about whether entrainment works similarly in naturalistic settings to laboratory-based ones, and as you may have guessed by the round 1 to round 2 length differences in these examples, we did indeed find that directors used fewer descriptors in round 2, demonstrating lexical entrainment. And our second question goes back to the personality data I alluded to earlier. Once we found out that entrainment works similarly in the wild to how it works in the laboratory, we asked whether it's different for introverts and extroverts. And the answer was simply, not really, at least not enough to detect. And we also asked whether friends entrained differently than strangers, and again, not enough to detect. But we also suspected that introverts in particular would be more open with friends than with strangers, so we tested whether there was evidence for that. And sure enough, there was. Introverts used fewer descriptors when paired up with a stranger. Their performance on the task, however, didn't differ, suggesting that their communication was more efficient. So to sum up, we found evidence that lexical entrainment works similarly in the wild to the way it does in laboratory tasks, but maybe not exactly the same, as previous work has shown very few differences between friends and strangers on entrainment tasks, and here we saw clear evidence of a difference when the director was an introvert. It takes a village, and we'd like to extend a grateful thank you to all of the research assistants, reviewers, supporters, and participants for the resources they spent to make this world possible, and thank you so much for your time and attention.